At Christmas dinner, my uncle said, "You don't belong here." So I exposed his secret. My name's Eric, I'm 32, and this happened literally over the course of one very long Christmas day at my parents' house in Ohio. I'm not someone who usually posts online about my family, but I honestly don't know what to do with what happened, so here I am. The short version is, my uncle tried to push me out of the family in front of everyone, and I was the only one sitting there who knew he'd been quietly bleeding my grandma dry for years. By the time dessert hit the table, the whole room knew too. But the day didn't start like some revenge plan. It started with me driving through slushy streets, half dreading, half guilty, because I'd already decided this was probably the last big family Christmas I was ever going to show up for. I pulled up to my parents' place around late morning, like 11 a.m. The sky was that flat gray we always get here in December, and there was this thin layer of dirty snow pushed up on the sides of the driveway from my dad's old snowblower. I could smell the mix of turkey and something sweet, maybe cinnamon or nutmeg, from the driveway, which is the one thing that still makes the whole family holiday thing feel normal for a second. I walked in with my little foil pan of roasted Brussels sprouts because I'm the healthy one now, and my mom immediately fussed over my coat, telling me to put it in the same closet we've used for 30 years like I might have forgotten. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door, the same ceramic one with a chip on the side from when my brother knocked it over years ago. The house felt warm, but it wasn't just the heating. It was that weird hot mix of oven air, people moving around, and too many scented candles. For context, we're a big family holiday kind of family. My grandma used to be the center of everything, and even though she lives in assisted living now, Christmas still revolves around her. My mom's side of the family is loud, opinionated, and passive-aggressive in that Midwestern way where people smile while they stab you with small comments. My Uncle Dave, her younger brother, is one of those guys who always has a joke, always has a drink, and always has some story about how hard he's working. He runs a small business, which is what he calls a construction company that mostly does remodeling jobs. Growing up, he was the fun uncle. As adults, most of us eventually realized he's also the kind of guy who borrows money and forgets to pay it back. My grandma bailed him out more times than I can count. Everyone knows that in a vague way, but I'm the only one who's seen the actual numbers. I only saw those numbers because I'm the one who got stuck handling some of my grandma's paperwork this year. She trusts me for some reason, probably because I'm the boring one who actually reads things. A couple months before Christmas, the assisted living place called my mom saying a payment was late, which was weird because my grandma's pension and Social Security should cover most of it, and my parents help with the rest. My mom freaked out and asked me to go through the online statements with her. That's when we saw a series of withdrawals from one of my grandma's accounts that made no sense. Not small stuff either. I'm talking thousands, like $3,000 here, $5,000 there. The memos were things like contract work and loan repayment, but the dates lined up suspiciously well with times my uncle's business had a slow month. We didn't confront him right away. My mom literally started shaking when she realized how much money was gone, and my dad kept saying, "There has to be an explanation," like a broken record. I suggested we talk to Grandma first, which we did, in her tiny room at the facility that smells like disinfectant and coffee. She looked embarrassed before we even finished the question. She admitted she'd been giving Uncle Dave money for business expenses and short-term loans for years, and that he'd promised her he'd make it right once he got a big contract. She had this small spiral notebook in her bedside table with amounts and dates scribbled down in her shaky handwriting. $2,500, $3,000, for $1,200. At the bottom of one page, she'd written "Dave says last time" and circled it. That note was from 8 months ago. There were more entries after it. So going into Christmas, I already knew my uncle had basically turned my grandma into his personal bank, and the account that's supposed to keep her in that facility comfortably was a lot lighter than anyone thought. I also knew something else that my parents didn't. My grandma had told me, almost casually while we were going through her stuff, that she'd updated her will the year before. She said she felt guilty relying on my parents so much, and she wanted to make sure I got something for all the help and driving around I'd done. According to her, there was a small investment account that was going to me directly because she didn't trust my uncle not to borrow from it. She literally said that, and then laughed like it was just one of those things. I didn't laugh. That account was the only thing he hadn't touched yet. I had printed copies of the bank statements and her little notebook pages and stuck them in a plain manila envelope, which I kept in my backpack like some paranoid person. I wasn't planning to bring it up at Christmas. I really wasn't. My plan was to wait until after the holidays, sit down with my parents, and then maybe confront Uncle Dave privately. But the whole drive to my parents' place that morning, that envelope felt like it weighed 5 pounds in my bag. Every time I hit a red light, I thought about turning around and going home. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was family business, and airing it out would just blow everything up. At the same time, I kept picturing my grandma's face when she said she hoped there'd be enough left for her care if she lived a long time. She's 84. A long time is relative at that point. Back to the day itself. Inside the house, my mom was in full stressed hostess mode, flipping between basting the turkey and rearranging the living room pillows like anyone cared. My dad had football on low volume in the background, sitting in his usual recliner with a beer he'd opened just to taste, but was already halfway through. My younger sister, Jess, was at the dining table wrapping last-minute gifts in a panic, using whatever mismatched paper my mom had left in the closet. She waved at me with a roll of tape stuck to her wrist. There were already signs of who was coming. My uncle's ugly green parka was slung over one dining chair, and I could see his work boots by the mat near the back door. The fridge was full of store-brand sodas and some cheap beer he always brings and acts like is a gift. Uncle Dave himself was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a red Solo cup in hand, laughing too loudly at his own story about a client who didn't understand how expensive lumber is now. He clapped me on the back when he saw me, hard enough to make me stumble a step. "There he is, the big city guy," he said, because I moved to Columbus and apparently that makes me some kind of outsider. I just forced a smile and said hey. I could smell whatever he was drinking, definitely not just soda. My aunt, his wife, hovered around him, doing that thing where she nervously laughs at everything he says like her mouth is on autopilot. My cousins were already downstairs in the basement, playing video games, judging by the noise. On the surface, it looked like every other Christmas. Underneath, I felt like I was walking around with a bomb in my backpack. Most of the afternoon was the usual pattern. Small talk, football, people floating in and out of the kitchen to help, but mostly getting in the way. My mom had Christmas music playing on a Bluetooth speaker, low enough that you could still hear her sigh every time someone opened the oven. It was one of those days where you're constantly moving, but not actually doing anything important. I helped my dad carry folding chairs up from the basement, set out the extra leaf in the dining table, and folded paper napkins that my mom insisted be placed like little fans, which no one ever notices. Every time I walked past the hall closet where my backpack was, I thought about that envelope. I could almost feel where it was in the front pocket, between my headphones and a pack of gum. I kept telling myself, not today. Just get through today. Things really started to shift about an hour before dinner. My grandma arrived in the transport van from the facility, in her thick winter coat that's still too big on her now. The driver helped her up the walkway while my mom fidgeted with her scarf, like that would somehow make her walk steadier. When my grandma got inside, she did the usual, commented on how good everything smelled, patted my face like I was still 12, and asked if the cat was still alive. She moved slower than last year, and when she sat down in the armchair near the window, she let out this little grunt that she tried to hide as a laugh. My uncle swooped in with this big, performative hug, telling her how beautiful she looked. He always turns it on extra for her. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I caught her looking at me over his shoulder for a second, and I swear there was this flicker of something. Guilt, maybe, or worry. We finally sat down for dinner around 6. The table was too full, like always, with way more food than anyone needed. Turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, my Brussels sprouts that no one touched at first, store-bought rolls still in the plastic bag because my mom forgot to heat them, cranberry sauce in the shape of the can. My grandma sat at one end, my dad at the other, and the rest of us packed in on the sides. The air felt thick from all the steam, and the window near the table fogged up completely. My uncle had switched from the Solo cup to a wine glass, but he was still pouring from the same bottle like it was water. My mom did a quick, awkward grace. She always trips over the words when there's tension, and then everyone started passing dishes around. There was that noisy quiet where everyone's talking, but no one's saying anything real. The first hint of what was coming slipped in around the time everyone's plates were full and people had relaxed a little. My uncle started in on one of his favorite topics, how kids these days don't know how good they have it, and how back in his day he was working construction at 18 and paying rent and so on. It was clearly aimed at my younger cousins, but the comments kept drifting toward me, too. Stuff like, some people move to the city and think they're better than the rest of us, said with a laugh that wasn't really a joke. I tried to ignore it, just focusing on cutting my turkey and not knocking over my water glass because the table was so cramped. My sister shot me a look across the table that said, just leave it. My grandma kept her eyes on her plate, pushing peas around with her fork. Then he brought up money. He always does, eventually. He started talking about how not everyone has mommy and daddy helping them out, and how some of us have to hustle, not sit behind computers. That last part was aimed directly at me, since I work in IT. My dad cleared his throat and tried to change the subject by asking my cousin about his college classes, but my uncle wouldn't let it go. He said something about some people thinking they're entitled to things just because grandma likes them. And that's when I saw my mom's hand tighten around her fork. My heart started pounding in my ears, because I knew exactly what he was poking at without even realizing it. He had no idea about the will change, or that I knew about the withdrawals. The whole time, I could feel that envelope in my head, like it was sitting in the middle of the table instead of in my backpack in the hall. The actual moment happened fast, and at the same time it felt like it stretched out. My uncle topped off his wine again, sloshing a little onto the tablecloth, and then looked straight at me. His face was flushed, not just from the heat. He smirked and said, in this weird, half-joking tone, honestly, sometimes I don't even know why you bother coming back here. You don't belong here anymore, man. You're off doing your own thing. This is family. The whole table kind of froze. My aunt laughed, this brittle little sound, and then went quiet. My mom stared at her plate like if she didn't look up, it didn't happen. My dad blinked a few times and took a slow sip of beer. My sister's jaw literally dropped. My grandma set her fork down very carefully, like she was afraid of making noise. I felt my face go hot, but my hands were cold. There's no better way to describe it. My first instinct was to just stand up and leave, to grab my coat and keys and drive home and never come back. I could feel everyone waiting to see what I'd do. It was one of those moments where the air feels heavy, like it's pressing on your shoulders. I swallowed hard, wiped my hands on my napkin even though they weren't dirty, and realized that walking away would basically prove him right, or at least let him keep talking like that. My whole life, my role in this family has been to keep the peace, to eat crap quietly, so everyone else stays comfortable. But I wasn't the one stealing from an 84-year-old woman and then sitting at her table acting like I was more family than anyone else. I stared at him for a second, then at my grandma, and I knew I wasn't going to stay quiet this time. I don't know what exactly pushed me to stand up in that moment, but I remember the chair legs scraping against the hardwood floor louder than they should have, like even the house was reacting before I did. Everyone looked at me except my uncle, who suddenly found his wine glass very interesting. My hands were shaking a little, not from anger but from that kind of cold adrenaline that hits when you've held something in for too long. I told him, as steadily as I could, that I wasn't going anywhere and that if anyone at this table didn't belong, it wasn't me. My dad tried to interrupt with a quiet, Eric, but I kept talking. I said I was tired of pretending everything was normal when it wasn't, and tired of watching him treat grandma like she was his personal ATM. The word ATM made my aunt flinch. That was the first time the room made an actual sound besides breathing. My uncle laughed, this short, forced bark like he'd just heard a bad joke, and told me I didn't know what I was talking about. His voice got louder, and he waved his fork at me like I was some kid throwing a tantrum. He said everyone knew he helped grandma with her errands, and that she'd asked him to take care of things because some people were too busy. I felt something click in me at that, like a gear shifting. My grandma's eyes dropped to her napkin, and she started folding and unfolding it with her thumb. It was such a small motion, but it told me she was scared, not of me, but of what would happen next. My mom whispered something under her breath, but it didn't matter. My uncle was still talking, still painting himself as the hero while he sat there with wine on his collar and a stain spreading under his glass. I told him I had the bank statements. I said it out loud in front of everyone. The whole table went silent again, but it was a different kind of silence this time. Heavier, like something was settling over us. My uncle froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. My aunt's face went pale in this way that made her freckles stand out. Jess's eyes widened like she was watching a car wreck happen in slow motion. My uncle tried to laugh it off again, but the laugh didn't land. He told me to stop making accusations you can't back up, and I felt the heat rising in my chest. I walked to the hall closet, grabbed my backpack, and pulled out the manila envelope. When I dropped it onto the table next to the casserole dish, the sound was louder than I expected. My dad whispered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. My uncle stared at the envelope like it was a snake. He didn't reach for it. No one did. I opened it myself and slid the statements toward my grandma first, not him. I didn't want to embarrass her, but I needed her to know I wasn't attacking her. I was protecting her. She didn't pick them up. Her hands were trembling too much, but she nodded like she wanted me to keep going. I said the withdrawals weren't small. Some of them were thousands. I pointed to the dates, the amounts, the memos. My uncle's face turned a deeper shade of red, and he muttered something about misunderstandings and family helping family. His voice cracked on the word helping. My aunt reached for his arm, but he shrugged her off. My mom wiped her eyes silently. My dad looked exhausted, like the whole thing was a burden he had hoped would disappear if no one talked about it. Then came the part one wasn't sure I should say, but the anger and sadness mixed together and pushed it out anyway. I said Grandma had updated her will. I didn't say how much or what was in the account. I just said she had changed it because she didn't trust everything to be handled fairly. My uncle snapped at that. He slammed his hand on the table, making the wine glasses rattle. He said I was manipulating her. He said I'd poisoned her against him. He said I'd only been visiting her to get in her head. Hearing those words come out of his mouth actually made my stomach twist. This man who had been draining her accounts for years was now accusing me of being the leech. My grandma whispered his name, just David, but he didn't look at her. He didn't even blink. My sister was the one who broke the tension. She reached for one of the statements, her bracelet clinking softly against the dish next to her. She read it slowly, her lips moving without sound, and then asked him why Grandma was paying for contract work in months when he hadn't done any actual construction at her place. My uncle stammered, trying to come up with some explanation, but the words tangled. He said he'd helped her with household stuff, but he couldn't name anything specific. My aunt looked like she wanted to disappear into the chair. My dad rested his forehead on his hand. My mom finally spoke and asked, quietly, almost pleading, where the money had gone. My uncle didn't answer. He just stared at me like I'd ruined everything, when all I'd done was uncover what he'd built. The temperature in the room felt like it shifted. Not literally, but emotionally, like everyone suddenly had to sit with the truth instead of the version he'd been presenting for years. My grandma spoke again, barely louder than a whisper, saying she'd never intended for this to happen at Christmas, that she just wanted everyone to be okay. Her voice cracked in the middle of it, and that broke me a little. She said she'd given Dave money because he told her he needed it, and she thought she was helping. She said she didn't know it was coming out of the account meant for her care. At that, my uncle finally reacted. He closed his eyes and shook his head, muttering, "Mom, don't do this." It didn't sound like concern. It sounded like someone watching their story fall apart. I didn't raise my voice. I just told him that needing help wasn't the problem. Stealing it and lying about it was. He scoffed and said it wasn't stealing if she'd agreed, but even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. My aunt whispered his name, her voice shaking, but he ignored her. He said I had no right to go through her accounts. I told him I did, because the facility had called, and because Mom had asked me to. I reminded him that the late payment notice arrived the same week. He withdrew almost $5,000. He slammed his fist down again, this time hard enough to knock over his wine glass. Red wine spread across the tablecloth, creeping toward the turkey platter. No one rushed to clean it. My mom just stared at it like it was symbolic of something breaking open that she couldn't hide anymore. My uncle stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled. He said he was done with this ambush, and that if the family wanted to believe some city slicker over him, then that was their problem. The insult didn't even sting anymore. It just sounded desperate. He grabbed his coat off the back of the chair and told my grandma he'd talk to her later, which made my sister whisper, "No, you won't." He pretended not to hear. My aunt stood too, but she didn't move right away. She kept looking between him and the table like she wasn't sure which direction her life was supposed to go in at that exact moment. My cousins had come halfway up the stairs, probably because of the shouting, but froze when they saw the scene. My uncle muttered something I couldn't make out and headed for the door. He didn't make it out before my grandma spoke again, louder this time. She said, clear as day, "David, don't leave." He stopped at the doorway but didn't turn around. She told him she wanted the money back, not all at once, but something, anything, to show he wasn't taking advantage of her. Her voice was shaking, but there was a firmness underneath it I hadn't heard from her in years. Everyone held their breath. My uncle stood there for a long few seconds, then finally looked back at her. His face wasn't angry anymore, just empty. He said he didn't have it. Not couldn't get it right now. Not would try. Just didn't have it. Then he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, and the house went so quiet you could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The moment the door closed behind him, the room stayed frozen in this strange, suspended state where nobody knew what the next acceptable movement was supposed to be. My aunt stood there for a second, clutching her coat to her chest, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for instructions. Eventually, she whispered a soft, "I'm sorry," barely audible, and followed him out, though much slower than he had left. My cousins, still halfway up the stairs, quietly backed up until I couldn't see them anymore, their footsteps muffled like they were trying not to disturb a crime scene. My mom brought her hands up to her face, pressing them against her temples like she had a migraine coming on. My dad let out this long, tired sigh that didn't sound angry, just defeated. My grandma stared at the spot where my uncle had been standing, her lips trembling slightly, like she was replaying the moment in her head and trying to understand how her son had walked out after admitting he'd taken money he couldn't replace. I sat back down slowly because my legs felt shaky and the chair creaked when I put weight on it. Nobody said anything for a full minute. The turkey was cooling on the table, steam fading, gravy thickening at the edges. The wine stain near the platter had spread wider, soaking into the tablecloth in an ugly, uneven shape. My sister reached over and grabbed one of the napkins to dab at it, but my mom quietly told her not to bother. It was such a small moment, but it hit me harder than I expected, like she wasn't just talking about the spill. My dad cleared his throat a couple of times, probably trying to think of something parental or grounding to say, but whatever it was never came out. The air felt thick enough that breathing required effort. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. Eventually, my grandma spoke again, just a small, shaky, "I didn't want it to be like this." She wasn't crying exactly, but her eyes were glossy, and her voice was thin. I scooted my chair closer to her and rested my hand lightly on the arm of her chair. She squeezed my fingers weakly, and for a second, she looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. She said she thought she was helping him, that he always sounded so desperate when he asked. She said she didn't want anyone to fight. The guilt in her voice was sharp, and I hated that she felt responsible for any of this. My mom whispered that Grandma had nothing to apologize for, and Jess nodded aggressively like she dared anyone to disagree. The only sound after that was the ticking of the kitchen clock, marking every second that passed in that uncomfortable stillness. My dad finally stood up from his chair, pushing it back slowly, and walked into the kitchen. None of us followed him, but we could hear the clatter of dishes and the run of the tap, like he just needed something to do with his hands. My mom got up next, picking up empty serving bowls and setting them aside, though she wasn't actually cleaning, just moving things around like she needed a task to anchor herself. Jess started stacking plates quietly. No one spoke, and I didn't know if we were all trying not to make Grandma feel worse or if everyone was just processing the fact that the facade of our holiday had cracked wide open. I kept looking at the front door, expecting it to open again, expecting my uncle to come back in with some half-hearted apology or excuse, but it stayed closed. The hallway felt colder now, like the heat had dropped a couple of degrees. We eventually moved away from the table and into the living room, leaving the mess behind like it belonged to another version of us. My grandma sat on the couch, holding a tissue in one hand, though she hadn't used it. She stared at the coffee table, not at any particular object, just at the surface, like her thoughts were scattered across it. Jess sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. My mom perched on the ottoman across from them, arms folded tight, her foot tapping in small, nervous beats. I stayed standing for a while, leaning against the doorway, because sitting felt too final, too much like admitting the night was over in the worst possible way. My dad came back from the kitchen holding 4 mugs of tea, his hands shaking enough that a little spilled over the edges. He handed them out silently before lowering himself into the recliner with a heaviness I'd never seen in him. The tea helped in a small way. It gave everyone something to hold, something warm to focus on, but it didn't fill the silence. My grandma whispered that she didn't know what would happen now. My mom reassured her that we'd figure it out, but she didn't sound confident. My dad finally spoke, saying we'd need to contact the assisted living office and sort out the account properly. His voice was practical but soft, like he was trying not to break the fragile calm. Jess asked if we should call Aunt Amy, my uncle's wife, but nobody knew what that would accomplish. My grandma's hands kept tightening around the mug, her knuckles white. She asked if she'd made things worse by telling me about the withdrawals. I told her no, that keeping secrets had been the problem, not exposing them. She nodded, but her expression didn't change. The weight of everything settled on her shoulders visibly. After a while, my dad suggested turning on the TV just for background noise, and nobody protested. He flipped to some random holiday movie playing on cable, the kind with overly cheerful music and actors pretending Christmas solves all problems. The contrast made everything feel stranger. The house felt too quiet, even with the TV on, every small sound amplified. The hum of the heater, the distant clink of someone setting down a mug, the faint creak of the house adjusting against the cold outside. My mom said we should probably pack Grandma's leftovers to take back with her, but nobody moved to do it. Jess eventually went to the kitchen and started packing things in small containers, her motions stiff and mechanical. I walked over to help her, and she didn't speak at first, just handed me lids and containers like we were working in some silent assembly line. While we were in the kitchen, Jess finally whispered, "You did the right thing." She didn't look at me when she said it. She just kept scooping mashed potatoes into a container. I nodded, but I didn't feel relief. All I could think about was the look on our uncle's face, that final moment before he left, how empty it looked. Jess said Mom had known something was wrong for a while, but didn't want to admit it. I asked her if she thought things would ever go back to normal, and she said she didn't know what normal even meant anymore. Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied it and kept packing containers. We finished in silence, sliding the lids on and stacking everything neatly on the counter even though the rest of the house was still a mess. We helped Grandma get her coat on when the transport van returned. The air that rushed in when the door opened was brutally cold, sharp enough to make her gasp. My dad walked her out, supporting her arm carefully on the steps. My mom stood in the hallway, rubbing her hands together like she couldn't get warm. I stepped outside too, holding the bag of leftovers. The driver greeted us politely, but I could see him glancing past us toward the house, probably sensing tension. My grandma hugged each of us before getting in. Her hug lingered on me a second longer, and she whispered, "Thank you." So quietly, I almost wasn't sure she said it. The door shut, the van pulled away slowly, and we stood in the driveway watching it until it disappeared down the street, its taillights glowing faintly through the frost. When we went back inside, the living room looked even emptier. The tree lights were still on, blinking in this soft rhythm that felt wrong after everything. My dad sat down heavily on the couch. My mom went to the dining table and started stacking plates wordlessly, but after a few seconds she stopped, looked at her hands, and then sat down instead. Jess took the manila envelope from the table and handed it back to me. "Keep it safe," she said. I nodded and slipped it into my backpack again, the same place it had been all day. It felt heavier now, not just with paper, but with everything that had actually happened. I could still picture the moment my uncle said I didn't belong, that cold edge in his voice, and how fast it all escalated after that. My mind kept replaying it in loops, like it hadn't fully registered that it was real. We didn't talk much after that. Everyone drifted into their own corners of the house, doing small tasks that didn't really need doing, folding blankets, wiping surfaces, checking messages that no one had sent. I stood near the window for a long time, watching the streetlights reflect on the thin sheet of ice forming on the driveway. The neighborhood was quiet, most houses dark except for the glow of Christmas trees inside. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Eventually, I grabbed my coat, hugged my mom, and told them I'd check in the next day. She clung to me a little longer than usual, murmuring that she didn't know what the family would look like after this. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. I walked out with my backpack slung over my shoulder, the envelope pressing against my side like a reminder of everything that had changed. When I closed the door behind me, the sound echoed more than it should have.